All right, welcome back for the last edition of the Cold War saga. The walls did come tumbling down. No spoilers. All right, so last we left off in the 70s, where America was going through some tough times, but there were some positive things too, including the SALT Treaty. That was an agreement signed between Richard Nixon and Leonid Brezhnev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union after Khrushchev. And that limited how many missiles that each country could have. This is the first time we actually had a limit on the number. Um, and it might seem like this is a lot of missiles because they are, because each one of those ICBMs could at least blow up a city. Our ICBMs tended to be more powerful than the Soviets, so we had less, but we still could blow up more. Yay. That's a lot of warheads. That's a lot of and the ABMs, those are shorter range missiles, and nuclear subs are still out there. We still have a few. They're out there with nuclear missiles because the thinking is if there's nuclear war, they know where our missiles are, where the bases are around the country, so they could attack those bases, and then they blow up our missiles before we could fire them at them. But if you have a nuclear sub, you don't know where it is, hiding somewhere in the ocean. It surfaces, it fires a missile, and then it goes back underwater, and it will hit the target. So this SALT treaty limited that, which was good for both countries because one, it brings some peace, and two, it cuts down on some of the cost. All this stuff is ridiculously expensive. Both countries are spending just billions and billions of dollars still on the Cold War, and they really wanted to cut back on that. As I said, things didn't go so well in the United States in the 1970s, or for the United States in the 1970s. It was kind of a tough time for our country. It was also not that great for the Soviet Union, and a lot of it was because they went next door to their neighbors, Afghanistan, and fought a war there that they also could not win, similar to what we experienced in Vietnam. And so, okay, so going back in the early 70s, Afghanistan set up a communist country. The Soviet Union obviously were involved in helping that government get set up in Afghanistan. And it is right next door to the Soviet Union. And Afghanistan, there you see on the map, is in Asia, kind of far from here. The And it's right next door to the Soviet Union. So it's not like they were going across the world to fight somebody. They were going to the country next door. The people of Afghanistan weren't so happy with that communist government and started a civil war to try to overthrow them. And of course, the Soviet Union is going to come in and try to help the communist government they set up. So thousands of Soviet troops went in there, Soviet tanks, all kinds of Soviet everything, trying to help the communist government of Afghanistan. The U.S., of course, just like the Soviets helped the North Vietnamese, we helped the Afghan rebels. Gave them guns, gave them money, and didn't send any troops in, but send them stuff like go get them Soviets, and tried to help them fight the Soviets. And it actually worked. The war dragged on, just like our Vietnam War. And by 1983, the Soviets were like, fine, we can't win this, and they left, just like we had to leave Vietnam, and the communist government in Afghanistan collapsed. Now the country kind of fell apart too in Afghanistan. Um, so that wasn't so good for them. But the Soviet Union, it really took a toll on them. They had spent so much money on weapons for all those years, and then they spent a lot more money fighting that war. And so the new leader of the Soviet Union, Mikhail Gorbachev, he quietly, without telling anybody out loud at first, privately decided this Cold War thing, it's just not working for us anymore. We have to find out a way to bring peace because our country is going bankrupt. So we have to end this Cold War. Um, and the other thing was, in Afghanistan, the country fell completely apart after the Russians left. And some of the anti-communist fighters thought that the United States had abandoned them. They thought we were going to help them rebuild the country. Whether we promised that or not, not officially, no, we didn't. But they thought we did. And one of those fighters that was mad and wanted to get revenge on the U.S. was a guy named Osama bin Laden. That's a completely other story, though. So I don't know if we'll get back to that, but that's a side thing. That is, things in history are everything is connected. One thing leads to another, leads to another. Um, Policy decisions have effects that you can no way predict, but that's how it is. It's a complicated world. All right, so Gorbachev, after the Afghan war, is like, yeah, the Cold War, we need to wind it down. So he's tried to figure out ways to do that. When President Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980, he was really anti-communist, really talking tough about the Soviet Union. But later there was a summit meeting between the president, Reagan, and Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union, and they talked peace. And they not only just they personally got along pretty well. They became good friends actually. When neither one was still in office, they still would like visit each other, so they got to be good buddies. And at one point, Gorby, that's his nickname, told Reagan, "We don't consider you an enemy anymore," which is something that a Soviet leader would not have said. Probably actually in the entire history of the Soviet Union, they would have never said that. But that started happening in the early '80s. And there they are, just kind of hanging out by the fireside, chatting like good old buddies with bad shoes. I guess they do a lot of walking because those shoes look a little worn down. By 1989, the Soviet Union had pulled a lot of their troops. They finally left the countries they had promised to leave after World War II. And they left because I guess it was the right thing to do, but also because it was too expensive. So they were just downsizing their army, and they pulled troops out of a lot of countries, and they finally let them have some free elections all across Eastern Europe for the first time since World War II. At least they were allowed to hold free elections. And like I said in the previous video, Berlin was the symbol of the Cold War, where East meets West, where there was a literal wall with soldiers on it, keeping people on the East side, in a totalitarian country, not allowing them to leave for freedom in the West. But in 1989, the wall came down, and there was no prior announcements. Just suddenly, the East German guards were ordered to just go ahead and open the gates and just stop guarding the wall without an announcement. And people started realizing, well, what is going on here? And pretty soon, within a couple of hours, it turned into a party. There were huge crowds on both sides of the wall, just literally dancing on it, as you'll see in a second. It was just amazing that suddenly this thing that had been blocking our country, and this country that had been divided for 40 some years, was suddenly open again, with no real prior warning. Just the East German government, again, they were controlled by the Soviet Union. They had to ask permission for everything, and so they asked, "Hey, are we going to continue blocking people from going? Because I thought we're like loosening this up." And the Soviet Union told them that's a sensible idea, and so they just stopped guarding the wall all of a sudden. Here is an actual news report live from the next day as the party continued.
From ABC, this is World News Tonight with Peter Jennings. Reporting tonight from Berlin.
From the Berlin Wall specifically, take a look at them. They've been there since last night. They are here in the thousands. They are here in the tens of thousands. Occasionally they shout, "Die Mauer muss weg," the wall must go. Thousands and thousands of West Germans come to make the point that the wall has suddenly become irrelevant. Something, as you can see, almost to party on. How do you measure such an astonishing moment in history? The East German government said tonight they were going to make more openings in the wall, at least a dozen more, put bulldozers right through the wall so that more people could cross to the west. The East German communist leadership tonight said there'd be a new election law guaranteeing secret elections which the rest of the world could monitor. And only 24 hours after East Germans were told they could go anywhere, anytime, the Soviet Union said that was a sensible move. Thousands of East Germans came across the border today, perhaps more than 100,000, so many that border police lost count. And at every border crossing, thousands of West Germans there to say welcome. Some of the really good news today was for the East German government. While thousands and thousands came to look, even gape at this showcase of capitalism, the vast majority said they would be going back. The simple act of giving people the freedom to travel may have convinced East Germans they need not take flight whenever the door opens just a fraction. It has been an astonishing day. Hour after hour, all through today, thousands and thousands of West Germans have come to the wall to see for themselves, to climb up on this hideous structure, to finally look down at what has been no man's land for so long. Finally, after all these years, to say in person what they think of the East German border guards, or try to make friends. Suddenly, a flashback to what it was like for so long. A young man in the East makes a dash for the wall. They catch him and take him away. Presumably, he should have used a legal border crossing. Only a couple of years ago, he might have been shot. Not today. Today, it was possible to have a dialogue. Your government seems to be changing every day. Where do you think it's going? That's the government's problem, he says, not mine. Such an astonishing moment in history. Now, what's it feel like to be standing on top of the wall?
It's incredible for me. It's I can't describe really my feelings. It's something unreal for me.
If there is someone who sleeps for 8 weeks and you told him what happened here, he thinks you're crazy. It's unthinkable.
Unthinkable. Tonight at the border crossings, including Checkpoint Charlie, which is normally a crossing for non-Germans only, there was still a block-long gauntlet of goodwill. Here, as everywhere else, it is one breathtaking moment after another. The new arrivals in their tiny, smoke-belching cars were greeted like athletes, patted on the back and cheered forward, sometimes pushed forward. Many of the East Germans were stunned by it all. I've been waiting 28 years for this, he told us. Will you come permanently, we asked. How long will you stay? I haven't much money, he said, but I'll stay till I run out of gas.
It wasn't long after that the entire Soviet Union came down. So, and again, Gorbachev trying to open things up. He allowed elections in the different countries that formed the Soviet Union. Remember, Russia is only the biggest part of it. There were a lot of other smaller countries that had formed together to make the Soviet Union way back in 1919, 1920. So he allowed them to have their own elections. And when those people were electing new leaders, well, a lot of those new leaders are like, you know what, we don't really want to be part of the Soviet Union. And so it started coming apart. By 1991, a lot of those countries were saying, yeah, well, we're untying this knot and we're becoming independent. And so on Christmas Day, 1991, Gorbachev resigned because he didn't really mean to destroy the Soviet Union, but when he gave people the freedom to choose, they all chose to destroy the Soviet Union. So he was the president of not a president. He was the leader of a country that had ceased to exist. So he resigned like, yeah, I just got rid of my own job here. And so he quit. And so the next day, the Soviet Union officially ceased to exist. All of the countries, including Russia, became independent nations. And there's a flag of Russia that they still use today. The Cold War was over. But like everything else in history, there's always consequences. Things happen afterwards. Everything is connected. So after the Cold War, yes, we avoided a nuclear war, which is good because otherwise we'd all be, if we existed, we'd be glowing and the ground would look like, a burnt piece of wood. But no, we did not blow up the planet. The thing is, it caused a lot of suffering. There were wars all over the place, as the US and USSR were helping other countries fight each other. And so it caused a lot of death and destruction and trillions of dollars poured into all kinds of weapons programs. Most of them were never used, which is good, but still, that money could have gone for other things, as Kennedy said way back in 1963. And still, we're not best buds with Russia. We'll get back to that in a minute. In Eastern Europe, West and East Germany reunited in 1991. They became Germany and moved the capital back to Berlin, and that's where it is today. A lot of other countries in Eastern Europe also had elections, and they have more or less freedom. It depends. They had no freedom for a really long time, so it's hard to restart a country with freedom when you haven't had it in generations, and actually in some countries never really had it at all, even before World War II. So places in Eastern Europe, some places are pretty good, some places still working on that whole freedom thing. And right now the world is a way more complicated place. It used to be those two big superpowers, the US and the USSR, and now there's not. Now the US is the most powerful country in the world. China is definitely second, but then there's a lot of other countries that are close. And the European Union, they kind of work together usually, and Russia is way weaker than it was, but there's still something to be reckoned with. So it's a much more complicated world out there. So you can't just say these two countries and they're friends. No, it's a much more varied place. And speaking of Russia, so people still get confused. They'll say Russia when they mean the Soviet Union. I don't really hear people saying Soviet Union when they mean Russia too often, but don't get them confused. Russia was only the biggest part of the Soviet Union. It is way, way smaller. As see as the map goes through there, 1945, that's when it, 1980, 49 to 89, that's when they got their biggest extent, where they had a big country and they controlled a lot of other countries as well. But since 1991, Russia, and as the animated GIF goes through there, and by the way, it is pronounced GIF. There you go, 1991. It's a lot smaller. They also invaded the Ukraine a few years ago, which caused other problems. But Russia is way smaller than the Soviet Union. Look at the population. Um, just about almost about half is what the population is now than what it was when the Soviet Union was around. And the percent of the world economy is way smaller. The Soviet Union had a communist country, communist economy, but they did have a lot of factories and they put out a lot of products and such. Russia, not nearly as much for a bunch of different reasons. So Russia, the way they stay relevant is they can't really fight a war like they could. They can't, pump out all kinds of military supplies like they did, but they can do things like try to interfere in other countries' elections, and they have done that in the Ukraine, in different places in Europe, um, and according to some investigations in the United States. So that's really that's the way they can stay relevant because their whole sphere of influence completely collapsed in 1991, and so they have to influence things in different ways to stay a powerful country. So there you are. We made it through the Cold War. Congrats. Now, go get your work done, and we'll talk more about this time period and more fun things next week.